All right, I think I'm set. I hope all of you can hear me out there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the webinar, Smart View Report Automation. My name is Craig Messenbring. I work for HCG. We're a company based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we provide consulting, training, product sales, custom-tailored applications, etc. in the business intelligence software arena. We specialize in the Oracle Hyperion S-Base area. We do consulting, as I said. We're a certified gold partner. We also provide education either at our Oracle-approved education center in Phoenix or via live virtual training, on-site training, custom training solutions, mentoring, etc. And we do support and development by providing system health checks, various S-Base add-ons, and support in the BI and EPM areas. If there are any questions that you have during the webinar, please save them for the end of the webinar. Enter them in via the text questioning capability. Or if you'd like to, you can email me or phone me after the webinar. I will give you all of my contact information at the end of the webinar. This webinar assumes that you've already worked with SmartView from an end user point of view. But now you're interested in learning about how you can automate some of your reporting using something that I refer to as the SmartView Toolkit. It's actually the SmartView Visual Basic for Application Functions, but Toolkit is shorter. So, what is this thing called the SmartView Toolkit? It's Visual Basic for Application Functions. And these functions allow you to automate some common things that you would do in SmartView, like connecting to a database, retrieving from that database, and disconnecting from the database, amongst many other things. And it used to be called the Toolkit back when it was called the S-Base Spreadsheet Add-in Toolkit. They've gotten rid of the word Toolkit now and just refer to it as the VBA functions. But one of the keys to the Toolkit now is that it's included with SmartView, whereas in the past it was an extra cost add-on. And because it's relatively new as being included with SmartView, it's only used by a small portion of customers, and a lot of customers don't even know that it exists. It's a simpler but less powerful way of automating S-Base. It's simpler but less powerful than this S-Base API application programming interface, which is another way of automating things in S-Base land. But we're going to stick to the VBA applications, VBA functions, I should say. So, presumably what you have now are reports that you manually create yourself, or maybe on a weekly, monthly, whatever, daily basis you get a report template given to you by someone else and you update it. You update the Q1 to Q2, or the January to February, or the actual to the budget, etc. And then you just update it yourself. And wouldn't it be nice to automate some of those processes by doing something like this? And I'll show you this complete example at the end of the webinar. But in this example, I've got a bunch of what are called Excel controls on a sheet here, a checkbox, a drop-down list, which they refer to as a combo box, some option buttons, which you might refer to as radio buttons, and over here a command button, with which I can connect to my database. I can change some of the members in one or more reports that are on my sheet, and then use use all of these controls to change members on the sheet. And once I select the control, it will automatically retrieve the new data based on the item I selected. So that's where we want to go. We're not going to go that far today in this short webinar, but you'll get a taste of it here. So just in case you didn't know, what report automation is meaning that the user doesn't have to interact with the report. All they have to do is press a button, check a box, make a selection from a list, and things will happen for them automatically. The report content changes based on the user's action. So in this case, the user's action is going to be to check this checkbox. And when they do, this cell D1 is going to change from actual to budget or budget to actual, and will retrieve new data based on their selection. And I'll show you it all live in a moment, but for now let's get to some of the basics here. How is it done? Well, first you need a macro. And if you haven't written a macro before, it's not that difficult, but a macro is like a program. It's a saved sequence of, in this case, Excel commands if it's an Excel macro. And you write this macro in this language called Visual Basic for Applications, commonly referred to as VBA. And it's the standard macro language for all Microsoft Office products. Then within that macro written in VBA, you will have some Excel commands, doing things like selecting cells, possibly changing the font, maybe copying a worksheet or a workbook, etc. And it will also include, in our case, SmartView VBA functions that are going to do SmartView things, like connecting, retrieving, and disconnecting. But in order to execute this macro, you have to have something that's going to trigger the execution of that macro. And that something is called an Excel control. And an Excel control are those buttons, option buttons, text boxes, combo boxes, etc., that you saw on an earlier slide. And these Excel controls will allow the user to make selections or enter items. Once they make that selection, the macro is automatically executed, and within the macro, you're going to change the contents of the report, and in the macro, you're also going to retrieve the new data based on what the user selected. So here's a complete example, and again, I'll show you it live in just a moment. There's my cell D1, which is going to be affected by the user checking or unchecking this checkbox. So they're either going to get budget or actual in D1. By them checking or unchecking the checkbox, it will automatically execute this macro. And this macro does things like change the value of D1 to actual or change the value of D1 to budget. And once we've changed the value of D1, we just do a simple retrieve command, a very, very simple SmartView function called HIP retrieve. The HIP, of course, standing for Hyperion. So the complete steps are, once you have a template and you want to make changes to it, you have to first decide, well, which dimension member am I going to change? And then you have to decide which control you're going to use to change that member. And lastly, write the VBA macro. And that's where some of the complexity lies. Deciding which member, creating the control, pretty easy. Now when you decide which member you're going to change, I highly recommend, well I shouldn't say I highly recommend, most people in most cases are going to change a page header. And for those of you not familiar with the term page header, a page header is like the POV in SmartView. It's one member from a dimension that describes all of the data in the report. All of this data is measures data, all of the data is market data, all of the data is scenario data. How do I know that these three are page headers? Because there's only one member from that dimension in this report. It doesn't have to be the top member like it is right now, but there's only one member from the dimension in the report. If there's more than one member from a dimension in a report, then it's only describing the data in that column. Quarter 1 describes this column, quarter 2 describes that column, or it's a row header. COLAs describes the data in this row, root beer describes the data in row 4. Etc., etc. So most people are going to change a page header dimension member because it's going to change all of the data in the report. But if you want to change just a row or a column or a set of rows or set of columns based upon multiple entries of the same dimension member, then feel free to do so. Once you've decided which member you want to change, you're going to have to create a control that's going to change that member. Make sure that it is an ActiveX control if you want to use a VBA macro. In Excel, there are two types of controls, a the forms controls and the ActiveX control. In Excel 2003 and earlier, if you go to the Toolbars menu, you will see a Forms toolbar and a Control Toolbox toolbar. The Control Toolbox toolbar is the one that has the ActiveX controls. The Forms toolbar looks very much like it, but is not the one you want. I'll show you what the difference is in 2007 when we get to the live demo here. So you select which item you want, which ActiveX control you want. In my case, it was a checkbox, so I select that checkbox, and I click and drag and draw it. Once you click and drag and draw it, you are in what is called design mode for designing that control. And when you're in design mode, you can do a number of things, but the two things that we're interested in are changing the properties of that control and then viewing the code, which means creating the macro for that control. When you select Change Properties, you're presented with a dialog box that contains many, many properties, some controls more than others. And really the only two properties that we really want to change almost every time is the name of the control, and in this case, the caption. So that I'm going to change the caption of checkbox 1 to check for actual and uncheck for budget. But why did I change the name? Well, I wanted to give this control some meaningful name. Initially, it just had a name of checkbox 1. And that doesn't have much meaning for me. So I changed it to CHK scenario, which means it's a checkbox, and I'm going to be changing the scenario dimension member from actual to budget or budget to actual. And also, by changing the name, when you press that View Code button, which brings you into the Visual Basic Editor, it will automatically create a macro for you. A macro begins with the word sub, and it will give that macro the name of whatever the name of the control was. In my case, CHK scenario. It will then append what is called an event to the end of that name, which simply means when will this macro be done. It will be done based upon this event happening to this control. And this event, click, means when they check the checkbox or they uncheck the checkbox. And then whatever's between sub and end sub is executed. So what's between sub and end sub? Therein lies the details. Now I have a couple more details than are actually required in this particular macro, but it's a good methodology to use. Let's just leave it at that, and I'll get to those points in a second. Now down here at the bottom of the macro, I think everybody can understand that we're going to retrieve data into this sheet. That's what this function does. Now, what's a bit confusing here inside parentheses, this is called an argument. An argument for this function is often called, instead of calling it an argument, some people call it a parameter. It supplies the information that this function needs in order to do its work. Well, the one piece of information it needs to do its work is, what sheet am I retrieving into? I could be in a workbook with many sheets. I could have many workbooks open with many different sheets. And by simply specifying the word empty or the word null, and if you look carefully, you'll see it's in blue, the words empty or null are both keywords to Visual Basic in that mean use the active sheet. And the active sheet means the sheet that's currently on display. And if this checkbox was on a sheet and you checked it, that is the sheet that is currently active and will retrieve into that sheet. Now what's the X equals in front of it? This technically is not required, but all functions besides doing something for you return a value, and if you get into VBA more, you will want to capture that value in something called a variable, because you might want to use that value somewhere else in your macro. So at the beginning of the macro, I've created a variable called X. I could have named it anything, Fred, Ethel, doesn't matter. But I named it X. And dim just means create a variable named X. Let's leave it at that. That's not quite a technically accurate explanation of it, but I can leave it at that. Create a variable named X, use X to capture the value returned by this function. Now, the function is going to do something for me, retrieve into that active sheet, but it's also going to return a value which I may or may not use. In this case, I'm not going to use it. But before we retrieve into that sheet, we want to check what the value of that box is. The name of that box, the name of that checkbox, I named it CHK scenario. And it happens to have a property called value, which I can check. And if that value property is true, that means the user checked the checkbox. If it's false, they didn't. They unchecked the checkbox. So if they check the checkbox, I'm going to use an Excel command called range D1, which means go to cell D1 and use its value property to put the word actual into cell D1. And the else, of course, means if they unchecked it, put budget into D1 and then do the retrieve. So let's go to some live action here. Now, I've already got this set up where hopefully it's working right now. And you see when I uncheck it, I have budget in D1. And in cell B3 here, you see the number 1890. But when I check it, I get actual in D1, and that number is changed from 1890 to 1998. And you can watch and you can see that all of the data is changing each time I check or uncheck that button. But how did I create the button first? Well, first thing I did was decided which dimension member I'm going to change, D1. Step 2, if you're in Excel 2007 or 10, make sure you have the Developer tab available to you, which you may or may not have depending upon how you got things set up in your Excel options here. And within the Developer tab, there's this Insert button here. And when you click on Insert, you'll see Form Controls and ActiveX Controls. And the ActiveX are the ones we want, not these. And again, if you're in Excel 2003, it's the Forms toolbar for this one, which we don't want, and it's called the Control toolbox for the ActiveX controls. But now watch, I'll create another checkbox. I'll click on the checkbox, I've got my drawing crosshatch there, and I draw my button. And something that you might have noticed already is that I've been placed in design mode automatically. This button has changed to a different color. If I check it, I'm out of design mode. When I'm out of design mode, that means I'm actually using this control. When I'm in design mode, press the button again. Now I can do something with the box to design it. And the things I can do are change the properties, view the code. So if I go to change the properties, you see the dialog where, as earlier, I changed the name. So I would change the name, and I would change the caption. There you can see the caption being changed. I'll also change the name to something. I'll name it to Fred. So I've changed a couple of things about this checkbox, but now if I want to execute a macro on behalf of that checkbox, I press this View Code button. And when I do so, it brings me automatically into the Fred Click macro, meaning if somebody clicks on my Fred button, this content, these commands will be done. But I'm not really concerned about the Fred macro. I'm more concerned about this macro. So when I'm in design mode here for this control, and I press View Code, you see it brought me directly to the CHK scenario click macro. And just to prove it again, notice that the name of the checkbox is CHK scenario. And within that macro, again, I'm declaring a variable that I'm going to use down here in this Smart View function, and then using some simple conditional logic. If that checkbox, if its value property, notice I'll delete the word dot value out there, and right when I press the dot there, I'm presented with a whole list of properties and other things that I can select from. This is what makes it a bit difficult, but most of the time, in most of these cases, you're going to use the value property. And if that value is true, And I don't know if you can see it, but the word true is not in black, it's in blue, because it is also a keyword. And how did I know whether to select true or false? Did I just guess that? Well, here's another little tip. When I go into the properties for this checkbox, and I notice that the checkbox is checked right now, do you see that the value right now is true? Whereas, if I close that, get out of design mode, uncheck it, then going back into design mode and check the properties again, you'll see the value is false. So that's how I knew. Sorry about that. There we go. That's how I knew to put the word true in here. If it's the value is true, then change cell D1, its value property. Once again, if I back out the word value and put in the dot there, you'll see a whole list of possible things I can do with that cell. But I want to change its value to the word actual or change its value to the word budget. End my if and my conditional logic there and do a simple retrieve. And if I take out the retrieve here for a moment, the argument, notice when I type in the very opening parentheses here, it says you need one argument inside parentheses here. You need the argument of the sheet name. And again, if I type in either empty or I'll switch it to null here, watch when I move my cursor off the line. Null is now in black and the letter N is not uppercased, but when I move my cursor off that line, it changes to blue. It may not be visible to you. And the letter N is in uppercase, meaning it is a keyword. And I know that that keyword happens to mean the active sheet. So once I've written the macro, I exit design mode and run my test by clicking on the checkbox or unchecking the checkbox and getting different data. Now again, this was a very simple macro. It doesn't involve the use of connecting to the database, disconnecting from the database, so forth and so on. So I've got a couple other examples for you here that might be a bit more exciting. Here again, I've got a command button here, a combo box, drop-down list, whatever you want to call it. I've got a checkbox. I've got radio/option buttons. And notice that I have two reports on one sheet. And if you worked with SmartView manually, you know you can't have two reports on one sheet. Not like in the old days with the spreadsheet add-in, but you can if you do use report automation. And here I'm going to ask the user for their username and their password. And once they've done that, they've logged in, and they can use any number of these Excel controls as many times as they want without having to log in again. And what I'm going to do every single time, once they make a selection, I'm going to connect them to the database. I'm going to change the items, change the cells based upon the selection they made, and retrieve and disconnect them all with one macro. So here I'll change from actual to budget, and you should see cells A4 and A18 change. So I'll switch it to budget, and both of those cells changed, and I don't know if you noticed that the data changed. I'll switch to variance. There, the data changed there. Variance percent, I'll probably have some decimal places, yep. And I'll go back to actual. Both reports are changing each time. In the case of this profit checkbox, I'm only going to change the first report, cell A5. I don't have profit down here. It's a row member rather than a page header. So I'm just going to change the first report and change it to profit percent and get new data. Change it back to profit, get the old data. Or I've got a combo box here. I'll switch it from New Hampshire to Nevada, and A6 and A20 should change along, of course, with all the data in both reports. Switch it from Nevada to East, and there both reports hopefully change. Switch it to the total of all markets, and both reports changed again. So that's one example of what you can do with report automation via macros. And here's another example. What if you're presented with a template and you have users that want to create multiple reports from this template, but they don't know what selections that they really want to make until the time they make them. So I've got 3 page headers here. We'll unhide the row that I've got hidden, my scenario of actual budget, etc., my time period, quarters, months, etc., and my markets, West or New York or whatever. And I've also placed in a dynamic title so that I can hide those page headers, but the user will see that it's actual in the West market for quarter 2. But this is the template that they're going to use, and they don't even have to know that the template exists. All they need to know is about the main sheet here, from which they're going to log in again, this time using 1 box instead of 2 boxes like you saw in the previous example, and you'll notice that the password is hidden this time. And once they've done that, they don't have to log in any more than 1 time. Now they can say, I want to create reports. And you can either output them to the workbook or output them to separate sheets, multiple workbooks or multiple sheets. I'm going to leave it at multiple sheets just to make life easier here in this example. And I'm going to create 3 reports from that template, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and West, for 1 time period. I could have made this multiple time periods here. I'll make it May. And for 1 scenario, I could have made this multiple scenarios also and created many, many reports. But I'm just going to leave it at that. So I should get 3 new reports, all for the period of May and budget data. And when they press the Build button, what I'm doing is connecting them to Essbase, creating a brand new sheet, copying the template essentially, throwing in those page header members, and then retrieving with the new data for the West and for Connecticut in May, budget, and for the budget Massachusetts in May. Different data in each tab there. So that's what can be done with SmartView VBA functions. You just have to take it a bit further. In this case, I added more controls, and I also connected and disconnected from the database. In the second example, I used what are called user forms, which most of you will refer to as dialog boxes probably, where I can ask for multiple things in 1 dialog box rather than just 1 item per control. I can put multiple controls. Here's 2 input boxes and 2 buttons in one dialog box. Here's a checkbox, a combo box, a list box and a combo box, and 4 radio buttons and 2 command buttons, all within 1 dialog box. And based on their selections, I can create multiple reports. So that's what you saw me do live. These are just screen captures, examples of the same thing. West and Florida, quarter 2 budget. Here's the budget West quarter 2 report. And of course, the Florida tab is next to it. So that's about it for today. Done just at the half-an-hour mark here. So if you would like to find out more, we do have a SmartView Toolkit class. It is 2 days where you learn about all the ActiveX controls. You learn about creating Excel VBA macros and using SmartView functions within those macros. And we even have a short class of 2.5 hours where we get you into a lot more than what we just did in this webinar, but not as much, of course, as in the 2-day class. So if you're interested in those things, or if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact me, Craig Messenbring, at my email address that you see here, which I'll leave on display, or my phone number. And for HCG in general, if you need to buy new products, get some consultants out to your area, need a health check, all those kinds of things, feel free to give us a call at our general number or via the website or LinkedIn, or watch some of these recorded videos via YouTube at HCG University. Let's see. Instead of making the slides available, we make, I'm going to a couple of questions that were asked here. Instead of making the slides available, we make the recordings of these webinars available on YouTube there. And Franklin also, yeah, the sample code is pretty much just what you saw on the slides here. So that's about it for now. If any of you have other questions, again, feel free to contact me. Thanks for attending the webinar today live. Keep an eye on our website for other live webinars coming up, or like I said, go to YouTube and view some of these recorded webinars. Thanks again for attending today. I hope you got something out of it.